All the characters in the story are over 18 years old. In his room, Stephen Wilson, dressed only in shorts, finished his last approach and carefully put down a barbell weighing 100 kilograms. He was breathing heavily and was covered in sweat. As he started to get up from the floor, he noticed his mother standing at the door of his room. She was looking at her son. "Mom, how long have you been standing here?" "Not for long, Steve. You really look very athletic. So strong." Stephen didn't have time to answer before he realized that his mind was filled with strange thoughts. Suddenly he woke up. It was all a dream. He was breathing heavily and felt embarrassed. "What kind of strange dream is this?" he thought. Stephen felt embarrassed that he had had such a vivid and ridiculous dream. He tried to distract himself, pulled the blanket over himself, and turned over, trying to fall asleep again. "I need to get this out of my head," he decided, taking a deep breath and closing his eyes. Waking up at 10 in the morning, Stephen went into the kitchen and made himself a cup of coffee. The apartment was quiet. He was alone. His mother and stepfather, Richard, had left the day before for a 2-week vacation in the South. Stephen missed his mother, but not Richard, whom he considered not the best person. He often wondered how his mother could marry such a man. After his father left, Stephen felt like he was in charge of the house until Richard showed up. About a year has passed since then, and the relationship with my stepfather remained strained. His mother always said that she needed someone to be with her when Stephen left for university soon. She explained that she needed to be with a man who would support her. These conversations confused Stephen a little, but he always knew that she cared about him and sincerely wanted him to be well. After taking a shower, Stephen got dressed and headed to the university. It was the end of the semester and his last day of classes before his final exams. Stephen was going to graduate in 2 weeks with a degree in 3D modeling and hoped to enroll in the master's program in the fall. He was on the waiting list and hoped that his 4.0 grade point average and a strong recommendation from his favorite professor would help him make it happen. Professor Isabella Carter, head of the Department of Social Sciences at the university, sat in her office and thought. The university had strict rules prohibiting teachers from having any personal relationship with students. However, this semester was coming to an end, and the student she was interested in was about to graduate. This meant that there would be no more violation on her part. Isabella had noticed this young man since the first day of class. She found him to be a smart, if a little shy student. Over time, he turned into a confident and promising young man. She noticed that his gaze often lingered on her during lectures. Stephen was clearly embarrassed when he was called, which she thought was pretty sweet. However, she always tried to keep her distance, following the rules and not allowing personal emotions to interfere with her work. Professor Isabella Carter decided to invite one of the students to her office to discuss his academic achievements. She stood up and looked at herself in the mirror attached to the wall of the office. She was wearing an elegant beige knitted dress. Not bad for 40? Isabella thought. She was actually 48. She smiled at her reflection, straightened her dress, and picked up her bag, heading to the auditorium. Stephen was sitting at his desk, waiting for Professor Carter's lecture. The professor began the lecture, as usual, sitting at the table. During the lesson, she periodically walked past his desk and touched the back of his chair, which caused excitement in the student. At the end of the class, Isabella approached Stephen and invited him to come into her office to discuss the letter of recommendation she had written for him. Stephen could barely nod, feeling a little embarrassed. Before the meeting with Stephen, Professor Carter was a little nervous. At the appointed hour, Stephen knocked on the door and entered. Isabella handed him the letter to look at, and then got up and locked the door. She invited him to sit next to her on the couch to discuss the letter in more detail. Stephen, feeling awkward, went to the sofa and sat down, trying to concentrate on the text of the letter. "Isabella," he began. "What's going on?" "Stephen, you can just call me Isabella," she replied with a smile. "I think you've already figured out why we're here." Isabella continued to smile, but tension hung between them. She took a step towards him, but Stephen stood up and apologized, feeling extremely uncomfortable in this situation. Professor Carter realized that her actions were unacceptable and quickly returned to a formal tone. "I'm sorry, Stephen. I shouldn't have behaved like this. Let's get back to discussing your letter of recommendation," she said calmly. Stephen, although surprised, agreed to continue the conversation. He took the letter and read it carefully, trying to focus on his academic goals. After the discussion ended, they both said goodbye, maintaining a professional relationship. But it only took a few minutes and they made love. Stephen got up early the next day. He cooked breakfast, showered, shaved, and dressed. He wanted to be ready to meet Bella, who promised that they would meet somewhere during the day. He was sitting in the room watching TV, but he was so busy thinking about Bella that he didn't even notice that he was walking on the screen. Thoughts of his mother periodically interfered with his thoughts about the upcoming meeting, and this confused him a little. Why couldn't he stop thinking about his mother? The doorbell rang. Bella, Stephen thought, jumping up from the couch and heading for the door. But it wasn't Bella who was at the door. His mother's younger sister, Aunt Sophie, was standing in the doorway. There were 2 suitcases next to her. Aunt Sophie, what are you doing here? What is it? He asked in surprise. It's good to see you, Stephen, she replied warmly. I'm sorry for my reaction. I just didn't expect to see you. But it's always nice to see your beloved aunt. Come in. Don't stand on the threshold. He invited her. I left my husband, your Uncle David. He cheated on me. Where's your mom? Mom and Robert went on vacation for 2 weeks to the south. Oh my God. I urgently need her advice. And I need to stop somewhere until I decide what to do next. Can I stay here for a while? Of course, no problem. Let me help you with your bags, Aunt Sophie, Stephen said when his cell phone rang. Wait a minute, Aunt Sophie, he said, and looked at the phone screen. It was a message from Bella. The text read, I'm almost there. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Stephen quickly replied with a smiley face and turned to his aunt. Aunt Sophie, you know where the guest room is. I need to leave, but I'll be back later, okay? He said, and went to the bathroom to quickly freshen up. Aunt Sophie stood in the hallway, slightly confused. A few minutes later, Stephen was already hurrying to the exit, almost knocking her down as he ran out the door. He didn't say anything. Aunt Sophie muttered as she picked up her suitcases and went to the guest room. Stephen, meanwhile, quickly climbed into Bella's car, which had already pulled up to the house. Stephen and Bella Clark had only driven a few kilometers when Bella said, I'm so excited, Stephen. I don't think we'll be able to get to my house. Please find some secluded place where we can stay. However, Stephen couldn't focus on the search. He was completely lost in his thoughts. A few minutes later, they arrived at Bella's house. She pressed the remote control and drove into the garage. Without closing the garage door, she turned off the car and pulled Stephen to her. When the passenger seat reclined, Bella climbed over the seat and sat next to him. Stephen felt his thoughts return to Bella, and he couldn't help himself. When they got out of the car, Bella took Stephen's hand and led him into the house. They went up the stairs and went to her bedroom. They spent time together until dark, and then Bella called a taxi for Stephen. When Stephen returned home, the apartment was quiet and dark. He was tired and didn't feel very comfortable after everything that had happened. Stephen went to the kitchen, drank some water, and decided he needed to take a shower. After that, he went to the kitchen in search of food. Stephen heard sobbing as he passed the guest room. He knocked on the door and asked, Aunt Sophie, are you all right? She replied, No, I'm not okay. My husband cheated on me, and I left him. When I needed a shoulder to cry on, you were busy. So no, I'm not okay. Stephen opened the door and entered the dark guest room. The light from the hallway illuminated the figure of Aunt Sophie lying in bed. He walked over to her bed. I'm sorry, Aunt Sophie. I should have stayed, but I couldn't control it. I'm cold. I feel so lonely, she asked. Stephen sat down on the bed next to her and hugged her. Aunt Sophie was warm and cozy. Am I really so old and unattractive that my husband cheated on me? Aunt Sophie was only a year younger than Stephen's mother, and they were so similar that they were sometimes mistaken for twins. You are a beautiful and very attractive woman, Aunt Sophie. I don't understand why he cheated on you. Stephen, you're saying this to make it easier for me, she replied. Stephen and Aunt Sophie continued to comfort each other until morning. The next morning, Stephen woke up alone. The sheets were tangled and a little damp. He found his wrinkled t-shirt and headed to his room. In the kitchen, he saw Aunt Sophie sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. After they finished their classes, the aunt went to the guest room to unpack and take a shower. Stephen was sitting at the kitchen table in a kind of daze. He couldn't believe his luck. Spend time with two mature women at the same time. He had had girls his age before, but they were just young. Bella and his aunt were mature women, and they responded to him with attention he had never experienced before. When he finished his cold coffee, his mobile phone rang. It was Bella, and she wanted to meet again. He went to his room to get dressed. Passing by the guest room, he told his aunt that he was leaving, but would be back for dinner. She looked disappointed and gave him a look that made it clear to him that she would like to continue communicating. It was hard to resist, but he lied that he had an exam at the university that he couldn't miss. When Stephen took a taxi to Bella's house, she was standing in the open front door and waiting for him. As soon as he entered her house, Bella was all around him. Stephen wasn't sure if he had the strength to go home. When he arrived home with a hot pizza, he called out to his aunt and told her that he had pizza and he hoped she would like it. She could only laugh. She told him to put the pizza in the oven and bring it to her room. She was more than ready, but Stephen wasn't sure if he could continue. Eventually, Stephen staggered back to his room on shaky legs and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, he woke up with a feeling of great excitement and called his aunt. He did not receive an answer. He went to the kitchen to get coffee. There was a note from Aunt Sophie saying that she had gone shopping and would be back to cook dinner for him as a thank you. While Stephen was sitting at the table, his mind was completely empty and his mobile phone rang. It was a message from Bella, interested in meeting again. He replied that he needed to study for his final exams. Bella was unhappy and expressed her feelings rather sharply. Stephen decided it was better not to answer and hoped that she would calm down. He really needed to study, but more importantly, he wanted to take some time off to please his aunt. By the time Aunt Sophie returned with the groceries, Stephen was more than ready to continue the evening. They spent time in the hallway, among the scattered grocery bags. Later, when Aunt Sophie was standing at the stove and cooking dinner, Stephen helped her with the cooking. The next morning, Stephen received a text from Bella. "It's now or never." He asked her to wait again. She didn't answer. Aunt Sophie went shopping, so Stephen spent the day studying. When she returned, they spent the rest of the evening chatting and enjoying time together. Stephen had his last exam on Friday. When he returned home, he was surprised to see his mother and Aunt Sophie sitting together in the kitchen drinking coffee. "Mom, why did you come back so early? You should have rested for another week." "I left him in Sochi. He gambled away our savings, flirted with waitresses, and drank too much. When I tried to stop him, he started behaving unacceptably, so I decided to return home. When he comes to his senses or runs out of money, he'll come back on his own." Stephen smiled and said, "I know I shouldn't say this, but I told you about him, Mom." His mother sobbed, "I don't need this right now, Stephen. I was hoping that you would support me." Stephen walked over to her. Aunt Sophie got up and walked over to them, and the three of them hugged each other, trying to comfort her. They spent the rest of the day discussing which of them had caused the most trouble, her stepfather or her uncle. That night, Stephen was lying on his bed in the dark. He didn't dare visit Aunt Sophie in the guest room because it was next to Mom's room and he was afraid his mother would hear. Aunt Sophie could be loud, and the last thing he wanted was for his mother to know what was going on. There was a soft knock on the door. The door opened and he saw Aunt Sophie's silhouette in the hallway light. "I was hoping you'd come. I was afraid to come into your room," Stephen said. "What?" It was his mother's voice. Stephen reached out and turned on the bedside lamp. His mother came into his room. She asked, "Who were you expecting, Stephen?" "No one, Mom. I must have dreamed it." His mother was standing by his bed. Looking down at him, she said, "Stephen, I could always tell when you were lying. Were you and Sophie close? I love her, but she's always been a little free in her ways." Stephen was clearly uncomfortable. "Mom, she's my aunt. What makes you think I was close to her? I've seen the way you looked at each other before. I thought something was going on. Now move over. I'm cold. Let me get under the covers." The next day, everything did not go as planned. Stephen woke up at noon alone in his bed. There was a feeling in his room that something had happened, but he was too tired to figure it out right away. He felt a little untidy, but coffee was more important to him than a shower. He went to the kitchen, where he saw his mother sitting at the table. She was on the phone. He heard her say, "Okay, I'll fly out tonight." Good morning, Mom. What happened? Stephen asked. It was the husband. He won a large sum of money. He asked me to forgive him and wants me to join him to celebrate the win. I'm on the first flight I can catch. No, Mom. He's not worth it. Stay here with me. After last night, I thought we really had something. I'll take better care of you than he will. No, my son, there was a mistake last night. You must never mention it again. This did not happen. If the husband ever finds out about this, he will be extremely unhappy. Stephen was completely devastated. Mom, please. We don't need him. What we had last night was special. Please don't leave. Son, I'm leaving, and that's the end of it. You and Aunt Sophie can stay here and have whatever time you want, but it's probably best if you both get out of here when my husband and I get back. Aunt Sophie came into the room and said, My husband is outside. He came to take me home. He promised to be faithful, and I'll give him another chance. Stephen, promise me that you'll keep what we had a secret. Your uncle will never know about this. I'll never forget what we've been doing for the last few days, she added, and then whispered in his ear, You really are a wonderful person. Stephen just shook his head. He felt dizzy. That's what happened. He felt that all of this was more than he could comprehend. It was all over now. Sophie told her sister, Little sister, help me pack my things. I don't want to keep him waiting. The sisters came out of the kitchen. Stephen just sat there in a daze. A few minutes later, Aunt Sophie walked out the door with her suitcases to reunite with her husband. Stephen went through the apartment in search of his mother. She was sitting in her bedroom, packing her things for the flight. When she noticed Stephen watching her, she said, Stephen, I need you to order a taxi to the airport. Resigned, Stephen lowered his head and headed for his room. He was lying on the bed, trying to make sense of what had happened over the past few days. He had never been so happy, and now it was over. He heard his mother call out to him, Goodbye, son. I'm going to leave. Call me when you're settled in. Stephen was deeply depressed. He perked up for a moment and texted Bella. His message was not delivered. He tried to call, but her number was blocked. He lay staring at the ceiling for a long time and eventually fell asleep. In the morning, Stephen was still depressed. He stood at the window of his room and lazily looked out at the street. On the way to the entrance was their new neighbor on the playground, divorced, with a teenage son. She was friendly enough, but he didn't find her attractive. Then she entered the front door of the building. Stephen felt a surge of energy. He quickly grabbed his jeans, put them on, and ran to the front door. Stephen was standing by the elevator waiting for his neighbor. The elevator stopped on the floor, and Stephen said, Hello, neighbor. She glanced in his direction. Hi, Stephen. Do you want a beer? She laughed. I've been hearing you all week. Okay, come visit. Yes, why not? Stephen thought to himself. Things are definitely going up.